And now we're going to take all of this Romeo and Juliet-ness into the most important place of all, your classroom. We've included several teaching modules in your packet that connect students with language, and that's because we know that actively getting to the language is a surefire way for students to get inside these complex texts, and you know if we're talking about complex texts what we're talking about. And now we're going to begin all this by showing you Teaching Shakespeare Institute alum Mark Miazga and his 9th graders at City College High School in Baltimore. His students are up on their feet as they begin to own Shakespeare's language and also own the play Romeo and Juliet. So let's have a look at Mark and his students.
See, Captain Nice.
Oh, where is Romeo?
All right, nice to meet you, Noah.
Nice to meet you too.
Yeah, thanks for coming. So today we're going to be hurling Shakespearean insults at each other. And lastly, we're going to look at how reading lines in different tones helps change the meaning and our perceptions of characters. All right, so we'd like to have a seat with this group. So the first thing we're going to do today is a Shakespearean insult game. And what I've done is I want you to see that this world of Verona that Romeo and Juliet were living in is one that was full of violence and conflict. And I want you to see that the language of the play reflects that violence and conflict.
Out, you great sickness carry-on. You baggage. You tallow face.
A plague of both houses. They have made worms, meat of me. Your house.
A dog, a cat, a mouse, a rat, to scratch a magic out.
The love our baby can afford no time than this. Thou art a villain.
Speak not, reply not, do not answer me. My fingers itch.
Oh, serpent hid with flowering face.
Thou detestable mouth, thou worm of death. I do bite my tongue, sir.
All right, folks. So I hope you can all feel the hatred in the air, feel that conflict and violence of this society that we're reading about. Now I want to do a little bit more analysis, and I want to look at how does tone create meaning? Okay, how does tone create meaning? I'm going to assign you a line. You're going to determine 2 tones to read it in, determine the effects, write it down on your chart, and then we're going to call you up here to actually perform it the 2 ways and describe how that changes the meaning of that certain situation or character and how it might affect the play as a whole. Any questions?
The first tone is angry.
Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
That makes it seem as to where the nurse and Lady Capulet's relationship is not close, where Lady Capulet is upset in a way to trigger a quick response from the nurse. The second tone is peaceful.
Nurse, where's my daughter? Call her forth to me.
The effect of that is that they're like comfortable with each other, as to where they could talk to each other, not loud and like angry, as to where they're just like really close, heart-to-heart friends, where she could get a good response that's not too loud and intense.
Thank you.
Love those students. Remember to keep your questions and your comments about teaching coming in the chat box. Joining me now in the studio is Sue Biondo-Hench. Why am I calling you that? Sue Biondo-Hench, Teaching Shakespeare Institute alum and also master teacher at the Institute, and an English teacher at Carlisle High School in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And she's the author of the Romeo and Juliet, Teaching Romeo and Juliet chapter in Shakespeare Set Free. So welcome to you, Sue.
It's great to be here.
We're going to start right off with a teacher in the street or a teacher at the NCTE conference clip.
My name is Jessica Pontu. I teach 9th and 10th grade English in Marianna, Arkansas, a town about this big, an hour out of Memphis. And I've never taught Romeo and Juliet before. I'm excited. I was actually Lady Capulet in high school. And so I'm really excited to help them understand those powerful themes, but I'm nervous that they won't see themselves in the story.
So, Jessica has never taught this play before, though she has played Lady Capulet in high school. That's a big plus. So that's a great prompt for you. How do you start? You've never taught it before, or maybe you want to try to start it a different way. How do you go about it?
Well, I thought Mark and his students showed everyone a great way to get into a scene from Shakespeare right off the bat. I mean, you saw the smiles on the students' faces as they got up on their feet, were given a bit of language and a chance to play with it and explore it. before they really delved into the entire scene or an act.
So connection with the language first.
Right.
That's kind of a mantra that we have here because
Right.
we've seen it work over and over and over. So, and you've put more than a couple of things in people's packets about getting kids connected to language. So even though we don't have a classroom here of kids, and we wish we did, give us an example of what to do.
Well, one of the activities in the packet is 2-line scenes. So in the packet, there are a list of a whole bunch of great lines from Romeo and Juliet. Cut them into slips.
Yep.
We just happen to have
You
a few
talk,
here.
you talk, and I'll be the prop person.
Okay, and then give one to each of your students. Have them spread the desks, put everything away, give lots of room for the kids to move around. Give them a line, have them walk around, practice saying it to each other, and then say freeze. Once the kids freeze, have them get together with a partner, have them look over their lines, and have them pull together a very quick scene with a beginning, a middle, and an end. Props if they like, though they're not necessary, and use great gusto with the language, and then they perform for each other in a little festival of 2-line scenes, which gives them a chance to experience the language and performance with their community of learners. Let's do one.
Exactly. So we've
Okay.
cut up the lines that you all have, we've cut these up because we're very good.
Okay.
And we're just going to grab these
Oh my.
and do a 2-line play. You go.
Okay, my naked weapon is out.
Ooh, he is not the flower of courtesy.
Oh, never. Okay.
So
great.
you have those things going on all over your
Yes,
classroom.
yes.
And so kids start with one line, even kids for whom reading is tough.
Actually, sometimes my students who find reading difficult find these words just magic, and they're all over it. They have such a blast with having a chance to say this language that is so powerful, so muscular, so energizing, and so unexpected.
Perfect. Okay, and then there's more in the packet on this, but language in the mouth, great way to start.
Gotcha.
So Jessica, for you and everybody else who needs to know that. All right, we have a question for you.
Okay.
How do you help students overcome the initial fear of Shakespeare? A great question.
Well, it's more of the same. What you do is you give the students an arc of activities. You start them off with small pieces and then let them find themselves in the language, and then all of a sudden that text becomes a pathway into stories and ideas that just resonate with them. Act 1, Scene 1 is a great place. For example, with that act, what I do is I have the students, once again, we push the desks aside, sit on the floor. Everybody has a hard copy of the text. We read it 3 times. First time, it's once around. Everybody speaks, and each line, the speaker changes each time a new line comes up, and we talk about the words that emerge. What words don't we understand? What words catch our attention? What does it tell us? Second time around, each student is given a character and holds that character for the entire scene. We then talk about the who, the what, the where, the when, the why, and the how of that scene. We give it the frame. And then finally, we assign characters again, get the kids up on their feet. Students who don't have parts are the directors, and we actually get it moving. And by the time that scene is finished, the students have fully invested in it, and they've started to do some excellent close reading. It's just on their feet.
And they don't even know they're doing close reading.
Right.
3D Shakespeare, actually, is a good way to call
Thank
that. The other thing about students' fear is often, I think students fear because as teachers, we fear it.
Right.
We think, oh my gosh, we have to teach this whole thing. Kids have to know what every word means. We have to start with Act 1, Line 1, Scene 1, and go right to the end of the play, and we don't. And so that's something that we often, among all of us, and I hope among all of us, we'll be talking about that as we go forward. Other question for you. I've been using the Shakespeare Made Easy versions with my students. What do you think of them?
Oh, Shakespeare Made Easy. I choose not to use those versions. I find that if you take a look at those parallel texts and you look at the Shakespeare next to the Made Easy version, all of a sudden you see how much life and energy is pulled right out of that language. And that's not what I want for my students. I want them to experience everything that makes Shakespeare Shakespeare, and it begins with the words. The other thing, too, with all of that language is that if the kids, feel like I don't trust them enough, then they're never going to just go with it and take off as learners.
And actually, I would say I have an opinion about
Yes.
this, and that is I feel like the publishers of those books feel like, what I say to students is they feel like you're not smart enough to understand the real thing, and also in some ways, I think they feel like teachers are not smart enough to teach the real thing, and the real thing is there's a perfectly good way in and around the real thing.
And part of all of that is it's a process of mutual discovery where the students and the teachers work on all of this language together, and they find a way to bring it into their understanding and into life.
Everybody's learning all the time.
Yes, all the time.
Okay, so
Yes.
Karen Mitchum, a teacher in Arkansas,
Yeah.
and Ashley Allison, a teacher in Texas, talked to us about the fact that their students love to, these two different kinds of schools, completely two different teachers, love to stage the big fight in Act 3,
Right.
the Mercutio-Tybalt fight.
Right.
And of course that goes with this little strand that we've been talking about, which is everybody
Right.
loves Mercutio. How do your students, if your students say to you, okay, we want to stage this, how do you work that in a classroom?
In a classroom, as I mentioned, that three-dimensional Shakespeare
Same
just
process.
works perfectly.
Okay.
Same process. Take a few minutes in the middle, though, to give the kids some basics on sword fighting, and then also give the students who don't have character parts in that scene some insults or some of those lines from the two-line Shakespeare, have them enter as citizens, bring the principal in as the prince, and just explode that scene as a class.
Perfect. Oh, that's great. That's
Okay.
great. New question for you
Yes.
we have. How important is the technical delivery of the lines for the actor or the student?
Well, for me, as I'm working with the students with the
You
lines,
answer for students.
Sure. I think I want them to have an opportunity to let the language evolve. I don't stand over their shoulder the entire time. I don't make all kinds of corrections. I let the students start to work through it. I let them start to understand it and to change it. I ask questions. I help them discover. We get input from the other students, and together, that understanding evolves.
It's also, I mean, in terms of technical delivery, I'm not exactly sure,
Sure.
what is meant by that, but I feel like this is for students anyway.
Right.
This is a process. It's a process, and so they're getting those words in their mouths
Right.
and they're rolling them around, and so the product of how they deliver that, at least to me as a teacher, is not as important as the process,
process I
of what's
agree.
going on in their heads as they take on this language. I'm not an actor and you're not an actor, so I don't think we can answer that question. But we'll grab Erin the next time and see what she has to say about that.
One thought that did come to mind is we oftentimes give the students a single line, and we ask them to take an opportunity to inflect different words, to say the line in multiple different variety of ways. And what happens is as they tease out different meaning by teasing out each word, the line shifts a little bit, and we
Yeah.
start to talk about which of those readings makes more sense with a character, a particular interpretation that goes on. So
That's
that
great.
evolution is great.
And Mark's kids talking about tone, doing
Sure,
different tone things are the
exactly.
same thing. Other question. What do you do when you have an assigned role or ask a student to read and he just refuses to get into it? I'm saying,
I see.
just refuses to get into it, acts either bored or downright hostile to the dramatic act. That's a great question because we've all been there.
Well, one of the things that I have done in my classroom, especially when I do an activity with Act 3, Scene 1, when we're taking it and breaking it into chunks and we're giving a group of students to take each chunk of the technical climax, is I post on the board a list of the characters for each bit of the scene. And then I just say, okay, volunteer, go for it. And I don't know why, but it just works. It's something magical. Some of the bolder students volunteer right away, or some of the students who have a feeling for a particular character volunteer right away, or some of the students see a friend going in a particular direction right away. And that cast list somehow always fills up. And then sometimes I think it's when you do allow the students to have some autonomy and work in groups on it, and they do know they have to put something together, they make the casting decisions themselves. And so they're working together as a unit, they take care of each other, and somehow the problem does seem to take care of itself.
I also think we've seen a couple of things today that help us with that, like Mark's students doing the
Right.
insults back and forth. So you start with a word. You have a
Right.
couple of words that you put together, or then you move on to a line. So then when you get to be asking students to read in various ways, it's not entirely new, and so some of that stuff might be helpful to you.
And all the students in the class are doing that activity, and it's just something that seems comfortable and natural for everyone as a whole, and the climate is all making a community of performers.
Which is great.
Right.
We have another question
Yeah.
for you, I understand. If you had to really boil it down, what would be the one major understanding you'd want students to walk away with about Romeo and Juliet?
Well, one of the things that I've come to feel, and I love my high school students, I've been teaching for a long time now, and I watch them go through the highs and the lows of life, and they understand things on a very deep level. And I think one of the reasons that Shakespeare resonates so much for me is his understanding of the antithesis of life, of the sweet sorrow and the brawling love and the loving hate. And kids get that, and they get it on a deep level. So when we work with Romeo and Juliet, we talk a lot about that antithesis and that push and pull that's present in life. And they feel like that's a connecting point to them for Shakespeare. and I know it's a connecting point to Shakespeare for me.
You and them, because you're in this together with
Right.
them. Yeah, as we all are together. We have another question? Oh, sorry, we have a clip. We have a wonderful clip from Ashley Mondale from Leechburg, Pennsylvania. Yes.
A challenge is always the language, but surprisingly, my special education students always do much better than the ones that are considered gifted or higher level. So we really, really have a great time breaking it down and talking about the emotions behind it.
So Ashley's talking about her special ed students, her special
Yes.
needs students, and
Yes.
how they seem to have an easier time sometimes than her more, she said, gifted students. So what's your experience, and what would you have to say about that?
Well, you know, it also goes back to that antithesis and that idea that life is a push and a pull and a tug. And I think because sometimes my reluctant learners feel that so deeply in the language, they're not worried about the GPA, they're not worried about the tests to the same extent that they're you know, the students who are more oriented toward achievement are. I think they drop their guard. I think they drop their guard, they have fun with it, and I think they're in some instances comforted by the fact that this playwright has captured some side of life as they know it, and they just go after it.
And these active ways into the text,
Yes.
I know, are really useful with special needs kids. I mean, I
Yes.
think we've all seen that in our work. Excellent, thank you. We do have a question. Does Shakespeare live anywhere in the Common Core?
Oh.
What a question.
Absolutely, Shakespeare lives in the Common Core. He even has his own statement in there about the fact that students need to be encountering Shakespeare throughout the course of their high school career. And so we've just been given open door to make sure that that's a piece of every child's high school education.
Yes, he's one. I think teachers are nervous some about the
Yes.
Common Core and where classical literature is falling, and that's
Right.
because of the instructional text that we're talking about, and how literacy now goes across many more subjects. Responsibility for literacy goes across many more subjects than just English. But yes, he's one of the few authors mentioned in the Common Core. And if you want to talk about analyzing complex texts and pointing to evidence and all that stuff, he's it. He's the guy.
If you could only study one text, it would be one of his.
Yeah. Well, we're a little biased, but
Just a little.
just a tiny bit. Another question we
Yes.
have. What's the best way to end a Shakespeare unit?
Well, from my perspective, it's a performance-based project where the students take everything they've learned about the language and the characters in the story, and then take another look at a scene and build it and refine it and put everything into action. So for me, that's the culminating
So
piece.
tell
Yeah.
specifically, you've had you had millions, you've taught millions of Shakespeare units. So tell us specifically a real quick example of one fabulous wrap-up.
You know, have the students do prompt booked, which is an activity that is something that people in the theater business use all the time. It's a copy of the text where annotations are made, which helps the students visualize the performance as they want to see it happen. They're making choices. They become collaborators with Shakespeare. What pieces of the text do they keep? What pieces of the text do they lose? How are they going to style their Romeo and Juliet? What time period do they want to set it in? Why is that time period relevant and important?
Do they work together or in groups?
work
in groups or alone?
They work in teams.
In teams. Got it. We have another clip?
Yes.
I'm Gwendolyn Nixon, and I teach in Richmond, Virginia, and I love Shakespeare, particularly Romeo and Juliet. And what I like about teaching Romeo and Juliet, I think, is that dynamic that there are two families who have opposing views, and kids can jump into that right away. They understand that kind of conflict.
So Gwendolyn it talks about the two families having opposing views, and that her students immediately can jump into that and can understand that in terms of making connections. I think about what Erin said about making connections between herself and Juliet when she's trying to get ready to play Juliet, and she's talking about her kids making connections with what's going on in the play, as several people have said earlier, including you. But hers is particularly focused on the two families who disagree with one another.
Two families. Well, if I can take it right back into my classroom today, we were talking about that issue, and we were talking about how feuds just spread out, and it's not just the two people initially involved. The tentacles just reach far beyond the family and deeply into the community. And I just asked my students, I said, come on, how many of you have ever sat at a lunch table where two people all of a sudden weren't getting along. And the eyes rolled and the groans emerged, and I said, you know, what happens? And they talked about the breakdown that occurs there and how when that breakdown occurs, everybody has to sometimes make a choice, and sometimes that choice is just to walk away. So that's in their own world. But then when you start looking at family connections as well, and the students understand that the push and pull that exists between families that are important to them through all different kinds of loss and partings makes life difficult for them, and they get caught in the middle a lot.
So it's a very meaningful touch point for them.
Yeah.
Great. We have one more question, and this is going to be our last question for you. How did you build a rubric for your performance-based projects?
For my performance-based projects, what I found is that assessment, I think, is the most useful when it's ongoing throughout the course of the project. What you want to do is continue to scaffold it so as you make an assignment, say, for example, some notations on the prompt book, you get a look at those and see how the students are doing, what kind of a track they're heading on, maybe make some suggestions. Then a little bit later on, there might be an additional grade based on, or some form of assessment based on the interpretive choices that they're making with regard to the peripherals and how that goes back into the text.
Great.
You know, and then eventually there might be a performance-based grade as well.
Excellent.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sue, and all of our guests and participants for being a part of this live masterclass.